may be good for those that participate. But we certainly know that they are not good for those that are excluded. Now, we talk about inclusiveness, but we exclude countries. It is impossible at the G20 to come back to an agenda that puts the WTO in the foreground and puts those preferential agreements in the background. Again, I come to my analysis, which says leaders are under pressure in their domestic constituencies to rather organize less than more globalization, and it's difficult to sell globalization these days. So, but then we shouldn't have those labels. And in finance, just very briefly, we discussed that last year, but for those who have not remembered, of course we have a big problem. The Americans will sooner or later raise interest rates. They will have to do that. And the Europeans will, if the ECB doesn't change the interest rate, will create a friction, which may lead to a rising US dollar, which may lead to additional pressure for the US government. Do we have the ability to discuss that in the G20? And I asked a relatively prominent member of the German government, which I can't name now, whether this would be possible to negotiate, to discuss that in the G20, and to come up with a statement that should be very moderate, that the G20 countries, at least the OECD member countries of the G20, agree on the need to coordinate, to raise interest rates in a coordinated way over the medium term. That would be all. And what does that member of the government say? That's impossible. Monetary policy is independent. Well, my question then was, well, what do we need the G20 for if we can't discuss monetary policy? If we can't discuss potential problems in the global economy resulting from divergent interest rates and potential revaluations of the US dollar. So, yes, I would agree. It would be good if we come back in the G20 to trade and finance, but there we also have structural problems which are not easily solved.
Thank you. Any thoughts, Stephen?
Yes, thank you very much for that. On monetary policy, which Herbert mentioned, I think actually there has been a bit of a sea change in the sense that up until about 2011, the Fed were persisting in saying, we do not pay any attention at all in any way to what the impact of our policies might be on other countries. That changed. All right, it didn't change very much, but I think there started to be a realization that the impacts of capital flows driven by QE actually were hurting other countries. The Brazilian finance minister Manteiga was very voluble on this, but he was right. I mean, there are implications, and I think personally that Congress notwithstanding, there has been a bit of a shift towards saying, well, actually, central bank actions do have consequences outside national borders. On trade, Shankar's quite right to bring this up. Personally, I think it is really important for the G20 to discuss. It is a quintessential economic issue. The problem is that trade as an issue is a very difficult one for the G20 to coordinate. I remember back in 2009, I think it was, my boss at the time, Alistair Darling, had previously been a trade minister. So he knew the subject, and he knew how important it was, and he also knew that he couldn't make any progress on it in the finance, economic and finance area, because in many countries, trade policy is driven by trade ministers. That's no bad thing, but it does mean that all trade policy is seen as the ultimate negotiation. You don't give anything away because in part because of the domestic constituencies that are so important. You know, it is the quintessential issue where any change produces losers in a domestic context who complain, and they complain more loudly than those who win. So it's a very, very difficult issue to get international cooperation on. I think it's made worse by the WTO, because the WTO as an organization is the ultimate consensus organization. You cannot make any progress until every member agrees to it. And personally, I think this position will persist until you move to something closer to a Bretton Woods organization, whereby you have agreement by, not by consensus, but by a large majority. I'll stop there.
Yeah, and just a few words. I would say as well that monetary policy is probably an area where there has been some movement, maybe not as much as some want, but certainly where things have changed. And it brings me back to also a bit to the part on the diagnostic that I was saying. I mean, I think one of the problems that we had in this area was that countries were looking at the phenomenon, or at the problems with very different, through very different lenses. So there was essentially advanced economies that had very loose monetary policies actually thought they were doing something good for the world, and could not understand really how the other side, including very prominently also Governor Rajat, of course, were seeing this as a problem. So I think progress has been made in two ways. As I think both sides are now more understanding of the other. And in fact, in advanced economies, central banks, I think, are more attuned, also partly because they understand their spillbacks now. So it's not that only that their policies have effects on the other economies, but these effects in the other economies will come back to haunt the larger economy. So I think progress has been made, and I think it's been very important to understand much better how the channels through which this works. And so I think debating diagnostic and coming to a common view is important, and this is one of the points. But I do think also that where the G20 has a role, because I mean there are, I think, objective institutional issues. Central banks have domestic mandates, and for central banks it's very hard to act say to safeguard a public good under the current mandates. But what I think where progress has been made, so it has been in trying to develop instruments that will help essentially everybody to deal with these spillovers. And I mean, you mentioned the issue of capital flows. I think this has been another area where a lot of debate has happened, and where a forum like the G20 has been helpful, which is to open up the views on what the impacts of capital flows are. And today, I think the kind of common view is much more pragmatic one. Not so polarized as we had it before. Understanding that indeed capital flow management measures are a legitimate part of the policy tool, of the toolkit of policymakers, which is something that, again, I think flew out of this process. Another area I think where there is still room to move more is in trying to figure out really how this global financial safety net works, in trying to avoid and break this tendency we've seen that emerging market economies are running large external surpluses, are building up very large levels of reserves, precisely because they want to insure themselves against these fluctuations. And there are certainly ways of pooling those resources in a much more intelligent way that will essentially allow countries to not have to run these large surpluses, which let's be clear, I mean, which mean also less consumption for those countries. They have to sacrifice consumption to build up these large reserve buffers. This is an area where actually work is currently currently ongoing. This work happens often in specialized institutions like the IMF, but I think where the G20 can really help is it can provide the political backing, it can provide the political support that will then allow the specialized institutions to move forward. So I do see a role there for the G20, but of course we need to focus on these issues and put them to the fore.
Thank you. So, well, let's open it up. Amar, I think you had a question. Usual rules, if you can introduce yourself. Everybody knows you probably, but still. And who you're asking the question.
Yeah, Amar Acharya. The question I have is, one of the themes that came out is the agenda of the G20 has become too broad, gone beyond its mandate, and that may have undermined its effectiveness. But the other flip side of it, which also came out particularly from the last exchange, is the reason that the G20 is perceived as ineffective is because it did not really deliver on its core. And what do I mean by that? I mean the stability and the growth agenda. And so the question is, why? And I think, I'm just pushing this a little bit again from the last exchange, that it's perhaps the cup being half full or half empty in that regard. So on the growth agenda, in the beginning, all compasses were aligned in the same direction. It was stimulus, more stimulus, more stimulus, and using all instruments, monetary, fiscal. And as we moved down, there were differences that emerged in terms of options. We talked about monetary policy. There was also a big difference in fiscal policy, particularly between Germany and the United States. And there was also a difference in terms of what Andreas just mentioned, what to do about safety nets, firewalls in the case of Europe, and a global financial safety net. Okay, so these were actually genuine policy differences that arose, and in a sense, the G20 was perhaps able to move as comfort increased in the areas, or not move at all, as was in the case of fiscal policy. So in that context, the Australian presidency may have narrowed down to an area of where there was some kind of an agreement, which was structural reforms. But is it fair to say, and it's particularly intended at you, Stephen, that was perhaps a distraction compared to the major debates on demand management at the time? So that's one question. The second question I have is, is the G20 really doing enough, or does it need to do more on the global debate on globalization, as Heribert was suggesting? Actually, the G20 didn't begin in 2008, it began in 1999 as the finance ministers grouping. And the first issue that the G20 grappled with at the time was globalization. Okay? What do we mean by globalization? What's the commitment? What do countries need to do? And then, in a way, for the next 15 years, we all took globalization for granted. And now I would say that, with populism and populist pushback against globalization, there is a debate about, what is the level of integration? Do we accept Herbert's view, which is more or less globalization, but is that really feasible? I mean, globalization means we are all in the same boat together. So can we really choose more or less, or do we have to have some standards on globalization? And should that be a major issue for the G20 to focus on in the next phase?
Okay, we'll take a few questions and then,
Yeah, Ashima Goyal, I would just like some more discussion from the panel on diversity. Because when the G7 expanded to the G20, you brought in a very diverse diverse viewpoints, different kinds of nations at different levels of development. But I was surprised to see that Stephen, in his three groupings, diversity was not there at all as a strength or an adjective to describe G20. Well, for Heribert, diversity was the problem, different agendas, and therefore it's what making G20 ineffective. And I think Andreas was suggesting that we need to go to even more diversity, bring in the X minus G20. But I thought what you were proposing is a more issue-based diversity on specific issues where there are stakeholders. So how can diversity be a strength? Because that was the core, one of the core attributes of G20, bringing in other viewpoints.
Okay, thanks. Any other hands? There's one right at the back. Yes, please.
I think one.
Just mention who you are, please.
Okay. My name is Sumitra Chaudhary. I work with the Government of India, currently posted in the Ministry of External Affairs. My question is to Mr. Heribert. I think he has mentioned that cooperation in economic domain is difficult in the context of geopolitical rivalry and instability. So are you suggesting that geopolitical issues should be brought under the discussion of G20? Thank you.
Okay, yes, over there. Then the last one for now.
Hello, Diptiranjan Mahapatra. I'm an associate professor in. I'm Diptiranjan Mahapatra. I'm an associate professor in economics. Actually, it is to the panel. What will be how G20 will address the issue of terrorism financing, refugee crisis, and also new climate economy, which is a part of the better part of a globalization.
Okay, and then lady behind.
My name is Soyan from the Korean Embassy. I will look at the institutional setting of G20. I think from the beginning we are quite clear that G20 is an informal political forum. So I think the panelists and the dais sort of share that ineffectiveness of G20, but I think that pessimistic assessment of G20 stems not really from what G20 has done or has not done, but actually where that come from our high expectation of G20. So coming from that perspective, do panelists believe that we need a formal institutionalization of G20, like establishing a permanent secretariat that could ensure more better implementations and more better accountability and monitoring? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, maybe we have some answers from the panelists and then see if there's time left, because I believe, Rajat, we have to close at 12:45, right? I think the first question from Amar was largely directed to you, Stephen.
Okay. Yes, thanks, Amar. You're quite right. The G20 did start on the issue of globalization when it was finance ministers. My view is that there is probably no other organization than the G20 that can discuss globalization. I think it's probably better equipped now that it is a leaders process, because as we've seen over the last few years, globalization brings in, it is an economic phenomenon, but it essentially raises big societal issues. And to be blunt, finance ministers are too narrowly focused to consider those issues. So it seems to me that it is right and natural that the G20 as a leaders process should continue to discuss globalization. Whether it can make progress is another question entirely. I think that the other point you made, the G20 process, it can't move when there are big policy differences. We may well be at the situation on, for example, refugees, on the issue of migration more generally, on the issue that it may just be impossible to make any progress, but it is better to have that discussion amongst the G20 leaders than not. My argument, I think, is that you should not expect that. That should not be a measure of whether the G20 is effective or not, because it's an issue which is too difficult to deliver concrete results, but it is better to have that discussion. Every so often, people think that it is a good idea to have leaders having fireside chats rather than signing off communiques. And I have some sympathy for that. It seems to me that actually there are very, very few occasions in the annual agenda of meetings where the leaders of the most systemically important economies get together in the same room. And you should use that time and opportunity well. If it's that they have to have difficult discussions on trade issues, or whether they're going to commiserate with each other about the problems that they're facing, that seems to me a good thing. Where you can get results, it seems to me you're on relatively narrow ground. I think that's the sense in which the way I interpret all of us is effectively saying, focus the G20 more in terms of delivery of decisions on the areas where you can hope to make progress. I can talk about other things, but not now.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. I think Professor Ashima Goyal's question was directed to all panelists, so I'll let them.
30 seconds on diversity. Yes, the G20 is a more diverse grouping than the G7. That diversity is a good thing, was seen as a good thing back in the middle of the crisis, because it was clear that the G7, despite what it wanted to do, was no longer capable of dealing with the financial crisis on its own. The G7 countries just weren't enough of the global economy. And some were reluctant to go down the route of expanding the leaders process to 20. It is a good thing, but it makes it more difficult to reach decisions. Again, the point I'd make, it is easier on certain issues than on others to have that, to bring together those diverse views and still make progress, still make decisions. On other areas, it makes it more difficult.
Well, I would like to address the issue of geopolitics, and of course,
on the diversity too.
On the diversity. Well, maybe diversity first. That is related also to Amma's point that you suggested we all sit in the same boat. And for me, the question is, do we? Do we all sit in the same boat? In other words, are the interests identical? If they were identical, it would be easy. But we have diverging interests, and that is part of the explanation why we have difficulties to cooperate. So the question, say, when we look at capital flows, again, this is an easy example, there are people that are benefiting from unrestricted capital flows, and others aren't, and others are negatively affected. So the assumption that we do sit in the same boat and have a convergence of interest, I think needs to be discussed. It is essentially the question, but don't elaborate on it, but it's essentially the question that has been put forward by Thomas Friedman years ago, who has argued that societies are on the same trajectory, they are just at different stops of that trajectory. At the end of the day, we will all converge. We will all have the same economic policies implemented. And that is the question. Will societies do that? will they want to have that, or will they ask for more? And this is a term from development cooperation. Will they ask for policy space? Will they say we just don't want it like that? It is a question. I'm not having an answer to it, but I think it's an issue that continues to be unresolved. Just very briefly on diagnostics. I think diagnostics is useful, but some policymakers do know what needs to be done. I'd like to quote Jean-Claude Juncker, who says, we know what needs to be done, we just don't know how we would get re-elected if we implement what needs to be done. So that is the problem of, quote unquote, the democratic preferences. On geopolitics, it would be useful, but we are seeing an emergence of conflict in international relations that might be beyond the G20 to solve. Just very, very briefly, it is difficult when some players suggest that international law is good for you but not for us. That doesn't work. And some players have actively said we are leaving that kind of level of cooperation. So this is a much more fundamental issue than the issues we should be dealing with at the G20.
Would you have the same thoughts on terrorism that was asked? Question on terrorism was raised by somebody.
I don't have a developed opinion, so.
Just on the question of institutionalization of the G20, for example, the Secretariat. I think if I think about the criticism or the more critical views of the G20 process that I can think of and I've heard, I don't think you'd have many who would say that, you know, the kind of lack of progress, or how you want to call this, is due to that we don't have a structure to support the process. So I don't actually think this is the issue. There are some internal governance issues. There's a question about, do we have an organization that is based on consensus? Do we have an organization that is not? That brings us back a little bit to the diversity issue, and I go back to that in a second. But I don't think, frankly, that it is the legal status really that is the pressing issue here. I don't, or Secretariat. In fact, I think there's many organizations who are vying to be a quasi-Secretariat of the G20. I think they get a lot of support. So this is not the point to me. I think the question of how to organize the process is a more tricky one. And here, please, I mean, this is just my personal perception. And as an institution, of course, we don't have a view on that. But in a world where really the problems of today's world that require cooperative solutions that are very broad, by many players to be present, you almost by definition need to have a very inclusive governance scheme to really reach those solutions. It is just having a few people outside of the tent can ultimately spoil a policy solution of a problem. So I think it's a difficult question, but a forum like the G20 probably needs to be quite inclusive in terms of the decision making. Otherwise, it will find that it loses the ability to resolve some of the problems. Again, this is a trade-off, but I would tend to go in that direction. And inclusiveness, as I said, I would think that it needs to be also to some extent issues-based. And you see that in practice in the G20 as well. So you see that countries focus on certain topics more than on others, essentially, when others they defer, and because it touches them more. And I think one point is that there's too many outside, in some cases, who need to be involved in that. Climate finance, or I think your question was more about terrorism finance specifically. I think to the extent that they deal with issues that are in the realm of, especially of financial regulation, of fiscal questions, etc. They certainly do have a certain place there. But again, I do think that more of the specifics, probably there might be other fora where they can be resolved, but the G20 can certainly give the political support to resolve and deal with those issues in those forums. There, I would say I do see a role.
I think now that we've crossed 12:45, and I expect people are getting a little peckish, it all remains for me to thank all the panelists for excellent presentations and engaging in a fruitful discussion. Some of the discussion, I appreciate, left things up in the air and open-ended, but I think that's the nature of the subject. And if the G20 can't always come to conclusions, I don't think we as the panel can come to conclusions. So with that thought, I invite you all to lunch. Thank you.